Hello and welcome to this tutorial where we're going to be having a look at Lightroom and some real life scenario type of things where we're looking at images and how I use Lightroom just to correct things and to basically get that perfect image exposure wise. And we'll also learn a few little tricks, but basically we're just going over the basic parts of using Lightroom, and this is the most important stage of using the RAW format. Now I say the RAW format, basically some of you may be shooting in JPEG, and you can do the same thing with a JPEG image, but you haven't got the same amount of control and the same amount of information within a picture to be able to get the best out of it. So I really advise people to use RAW, and then you will basically be much better at processing your images and getting exactly what you want. Now obviously you need to take a reasonable shot in the first place. If it's a really bad shot, forget it, delete it, take another. I say that most people try to rescue things that really aren't worth the time and the effort. You know, if you can, I admit in the odd occasion, you may have to try and do that if it's something you really value and you've only got that one attempt at getting the image. But if you can reshoot or whatever, that's the best thing to do. It's not to get a bad image and trying to make it good. You need a reasonable image in the first place. So learn about your camera and learn how to do that before going on to these stages. And if we look at this image, the first one, this flower, this is really common, especially when you're shooting white objects. You tend to lose a little bit of definition in the detail. I just click and zoom in on this. You can see the white detail. There's a little bit there. And that's nothing I've done wrong. Basically, I've got a good exposure. If we look at the histogram, and this is always the thing to look out for at the top of the screen here, top right, your histogram, make sure that's showing. And the reason for that is you can see a graphical image of your picture, a graph in graph format that your eye may not be seeing. You can't always rely on your monitor unless you've had it set up so that you know you're seeing exactly what is actually there. The histogram is invaluable. It may look on your screen like it's too bright or it's too dark, but the histogram, even without me looking at the image itself, I can tell a lot of information from that and get it right without even looking at the image in some cases. Obviously it helps you to look at the image as well, but it is really important and I can't emphasize that enough. Okay, so first of all, how do we get this deeper detail back? Well, the sliders, we have the exposure. Well, the exposure's okay. I haven't blown it, and if it was blown, we'd see on the right hand side there, if we've blown the highlights, we would get a little clipping symbol up there, a little white triangle at the top. And on the left hand side, we would get any black detail that was clipped. We would get a clipping warning signal up there as well. So we're looking at the main exposure settings, the basic settings, and we don't need to use the exposure. The contrast I very rarely use. I do use it on occasions, but I try to get around contrast in a different way. I may go over that a little bit more detail a bit later. The highlights really is the secret weapon in Lightroom for getting back that detail in areas where you've lost it, in the white areas, in the very highlighted areas of your image. And it works much better than in any other software. And I must say, Adobe, really on the RAW side of things, they do tend to get back a little bit more than you can get in other software, on the highlights and the shadows especially. But if you haven't got that software, you know, you can follow some of this, but you're not going to achieve the same as what you can in Adobe Lightroom. Okay, so I'm going to drag this down to the left, which will decrease the highlights. And if we look, I'm just going to zoom in on the image here. And if we look, you can see when I change the highlights, see how I'm bringing back that detail. Yeah. The other thing it's also doing is it's actually bringing down the lightness of the image. So actually the image is a little bit dark now, but we'll see how to correct that in a moment. We just zoom back out. You see it's a little bit dull now. But the magic solution to this is then to use the whites slider and slide that up. And we don't lose so much detail in that case. If I bring the highlights up, you'll see straight away I start losing detail. But if I take the highlights down and adjust the image using the white slider, I can get that lightness back to the image without losing much detail there. Okay, that looks nice. One thing when we've done this though, we've made it much brighter, is that green now looks a little bit bright. So we'll show how we can actually change that. We can change the saturation, adjust the green area on the image. But if we look at the whole image on the whole, I might take the black slider just down a little bit. And again, what I'm looking at is the histogram. I'm checking all the time they're not clipping. And that is the magic thing about Lightroom, always a thing to refer to. In some cases, you may want to bring the blacks down slightly if you want, you know, to create some atmosphere and get a bit more drama to the image. Sometimes you can bring the black down and do that. But what you don't ever want to do is to start clipping in the whites, unless you can help it, because then you're starting to lose that detail, just like we've got back in the flower. That's when you're losing information. Okay. So now let's put this green right. So it's looking a little bit too bright now. So I'm going to go down the actual toolbar on here, and we're looking for the colour. So here we go, HSL, colour and black and W, and it's on colour at the moment, which is what we want. Now if we look at this, we've got these different little coloured buttons going across there, and you've got all at the end. You can click on that and then you actually see all of the controls for all of them. I quite like doing that because I can then change not just the saturation, but the hue and the luminance of the different colours as well. So I'm going down to green, and basically I want to take the saturation down a little bit, and you can see now the green, it's got less saturation. Should we make it a bit darker? So that would be the luminance. We go to the right, we make it brighter, or we can make it a little bit darker. I'm not going to go too much with that. Just set it something like that, and that's looking a little bit better. I think I may want to go back to the basics and just bring that white up just a little tiny bit, just so it's just clipping. And you see we've still got the detail there. And we'll bring the saturation up just slightly on the overall of the image. And now we've got the perfect exposure. Okay, so that's the first image to look at. And I say it's okay learning about Lightroom and reading all the information of how to do things, but it's when you actually work with a picture of your own that you start learning. And I think using these examples just shows you that there's no magic setting. Each setting is completely different for every image. And if we look at this next one, it's not a bad exposure at all, but we can improve on this. You see it's clipping very, very slightly in the blacks. I'm not too worried about that. It's a little bit down in the whites. Okay. We want to get a little bit more detail in the clouds and the sky. And again, that's the highlight areas. So that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to drag that down. And I also want to bring out some of the shadow areas. You can see on this truck. And some of the areas, the shadow's quite dark. So I'm going to take the shadows up. And then I'm going to use the white slider to get the exposure nice and bright again. So Remember, if we take the highlights down, that brings back, if I use the highlights, you can see the clouds are going. But with the highlights down and then bringing the white slider back up to get the exposure correct, I'm keeping the detail there. It's not clipping except in the blacks. I can bring the blacks up slightly just to get rid of that little warning triangle. And there we go. It's still on blue, but I'm happy with that. May bring the shadows up just a little bit more. And there we have a much better image. And just to prove that, if we reset it, that's what it looked like originally. And that's what it looks like after the raw conversion. And it's important because people have often said to me in the past, well, you've told us to shoot in RAW, but I shoot in RAW and the picture looks worse than a JPEG. And that is true. What the camera actually does when you shoot a JPEG image is the camera is like a little computer. When you take a JPEG image, the camera tries to get everything right for you. So it tries to get the balance of the colours, it tries to get the lightness correct and whatever. But it can only do it to a certain extent, and you're stuck with that. You can adjust it slightly in Lightroom, you can adjust the JPEG and you can get a little bit back, but not so much as you can with a RAW. So therefore, shooting in RAW is much better, but when the raw image comes out of the camera, it looks terrible because it hasn't had those things done to it that the camera does to the JPEG. It's just basically captured the image, it's captured all the information, but it hasn't actually done anything with it. You have to process the image, and that's the important part. That's why we work in Lightroom, and that's why we can get so much better images using the raw file and actually doing the developing ourselves. It's like working in the darkroom. It's called the Lightroom, but it's like working in the darkroom. You know, we can dodge and burn by using these sliders. We can bring up the lightness, take it down, or bring out the shadows, and it gives us so much more power to get the image that we actually see with our eyes. Because when you take a picture with a camera, cameras are very two-tone in one respect. They haven't got that 3D effect that the eyes have got. When you look into the shadows, you see the detail in the shadows. When you look at the sky automatically darkens so we can see all the detail. And a camera can't do that. It's not that clever. It's nothing like the human eye. But we can make it more like the human eye and make it look like the image that we actually see with our eyes by using the raw conversion. And that for me is the whole thing about photography, is getting the perfect exposure. That is what I always try to do. You know, I hate to see blown skies. I hate to see areas that should be seen and can't be seen because they're in shadow and whatever. You know, and sometimes, yeah, you can go over the top. It's trying to get it just perfect, and you've got the ability to do either. Some like it over the top. You know, you can do that. You can give it the HDR effect if you want to put it like that, or you can be much more natural. But I think to try to get what was actually there, and not what the camera actually captured, but what your eyes seen at the time, and remembering what the eyes seen is the most important part of photography. Okay, let's go on to the next one now, which is slightly different. Now, in some cases when we got sun, there isn't a lot of colour here. There was a lot of colour when I actually took the picture. And this is what I say about the camera. It doesn't always capture what your eyes are seeing. You know, the camera does lie compared to your eyes. I could see some detail in the shadow. I could see more colour there. And like this again, using the raw conversion, we can get it pretty much how I saw it on the evening. So the first thing, I'm just going to bring the shadows up. And obviously it wouldn't be that bright because it's getting in the evening. It was roughly like that when I saw it. And again, I'm checking the histogram. So I'm going to bring the blacks up So we're just on the edge of clipping there. And then I'm going to bring the highlights down. And I'm going to bring the whites up just a little bit. And now I'm starting to see a little bit more of what I'm actually seen on the evening. I'm going to bring the vibrance up just a bit because there was much more colour. And there's more or less what I've seen on the night. So the whites down, we've got a little bit of clipping there. There we go. So that is basically what I could see with the eyes. Again, the green sometimes looks a little bit saturated. And again, I'm going to go down to my colour sliders. And I'm just going to take the saturation down just a tiny bit, not too much. Just a little bit on the greens there. To bring the lightness out, make it lighter, you can actually bump that up and make it a little bit brighter. And I think that's more or less what I've seen on the night. Okay, on to our next photo. Now in this case, the exposure is more or less there. Now, most top photographers would actually use a filter on that, a graduated filter to darken the sky when I took the image. I don't always do that. I do use graduated filters now and again. And if I do, I'll use a soft filter. Basically, if we've got a hard filter which darkens the top part and has more or less goes from dark to light very fast, it tends to, when you've got little things coming over the horizon, it tends to affect those too much in my eyes. But they are good, you know, and you can use ND filters to smooth the water and the skies and things like that if you wish to do that. But in my case, I've got two disabled children who, well, autistic children, who are quite often with me when I take my photographs. And I don't have time to set up tripods and set things up. I've got to basically take a very quick snap. And so I need to try and get things that way. What I usually do is take 3 images and bracket them. So I'll have one slightly underexposed, one overexposed, one at the correct exposure, and then I can play with each one of those, and if I can't get what I want, I can combine them and use the sky out of the one or whatever to get the final rendition. Okay, but with this we're just going to have a quick look at how we can improve it straight from here. So again, we go back to our basic settings. Again, I'm going to bring the highlights down a little bit, bring a bit of detail back in the sky. And basically I want to bring a bit more detail out in the rocks, and by taking up the shadows more or less straight away and then taking the whites up to get back. Can you see? So again, taking down the highlights and bringing the lightness back into the image with the whites does the trick again. And I would probably just add a little bit of vibrance and a little bit of saturation. And that is what I saw on the day. That's the colours I saw, that's how the sky looked. And, you know, I'm making it more realistic. A lot of people say, well, is that cheating? It's not. It's a raw file. It allows you to get the image back to what you actually saw and not what the camera recorded. And I think that's a much more true representation than what the camera gave me in the first place. Okay, now if we look at the next image, which is similar, took from the same place, which is a lighthouse in Anglesey. In this case, I've blown the shot. Now, I didn't actually blow the shot through bad photography. I actually done that on purpose. As I say, I take bracketed pictures, but this just demonstrates that with a RAW file, how much information you can get back. Now, basically, most people would chuck that if it was a JPEG. I'd say, that's just totally ruined. I've ruined the shot. I've overexposed it. But if we take the exposure down in RAW, And then I'm going to bring up the shadows. The blacks bring up slightly, so I'm not just on the edge of clipping, and bring the whites up. And there we have a perfect image, rescued and put right, and is by heck a good photograph. I'll save myself. Okay, so again, the magic of RAW and using a good RAW converter. Now with this, I'm going to give this a slight effect. Again, I'll say this probably would have been better with some filters used. An ND filter to smooth out the water would have been nice in this case. The clouds is fairly stationary, so it wouldn't have affected that, but it would have smoothed out the movement on the water and give me a nice effect on the water. But I couldn't do that. As I say, I got my children with me, no time to carry about, and those in wheelchairs at the time, so I couldn't carry tripods and whatever to actually do that. So we'll have a look at the effects on this. Again, I'll take down the highlights to bring out some detail in that sky. I'm going to bring the shadows up. And I'm going to bring up the whites. So we've got that, which in itself is a nice image. But sometimes with an image like this, not always, but occasionally, I like to give it a bit of a dreamy effect. And there's a nice way of doing that in Lightroom, and we can just take the clarity down. So the clarity slider, if we drag that down, I'm going to actually bring it all the way in this case, so I'm making it really dreamy. And I'm going to bring the whites up a little bit to bring them. I am coming over and clipping on that, but I'm not too worried because that's the effect that I sort of want. Let's bring it down slightly and just get rid of that. So we're just about there. Bring the highlights up just a little bit, and I can sort of see sun rays coming from the sky, and it's got this nice dreamy sleepy effect. Sometimes it's nice to put the vibrance and the saturation up on an image like that. So that's just one effect you can do. Something else I'll also mention, it doesn't apply in this case, but quite often, if we look at the leaves in the trees there, quite often even with, I've got a high quality wide angle lens, but quite often even with that, with wide angle lenses, you quite often get what's called aberration, which is like a redness or a green effect on the lines of dark areas that have got a brighter background, and it can be quite nasty looking. And if we go down on our menus on the right hand side and we go down to lens correction, and we're profile and manual, I always click that just to make sure that I've got no chromatic aberration on there. Sometimes if it's really bad, if you've got a lens that's really bad and it's creating that effect, I would go into manual and you can actually set how much defringing you want on the purples and the greens, and also widen the range so it covers it more, so you can get rid of it that way should not the profile way work. So I hope that helps you with your images in Lightroom, and I think it's nice to go through some real examples and not just have a lesson where it's nice to do that. You need to know how to use the program, obviously, but when you're working with images and you've got that little bit of experience but you're still not getting there, I think it's nice to look at different images and see how someone else applies effects and whatever to get what they want. So all the best from me, Les Arnott. See you soon.